The House of Dina Durbin, nestled in the heart of Hollywood, became the subject of many whispered tales and curious gazes over the years. Known for its stunning architecture and its storied past, the house was more than just a beautiful piece of real estate. It was a place where the extraordinary met the supernatural. It was said that, on certain evenings, if you stood near the gates of the house and listened closely, you could hear the faint but unmistakable sound of opera music drifting from the living room. The melody would rise and fall, as if someone were practicing or performing a private concert for an audience of one. The curious part was that no one ever saw anyone singing. The music seemed to echo from the walls, lingering in the air like a ghostly performance. The most chilling part of the house, however, was its chandeliers. Visitors and residents alike would often comment on a strange phenomenon late at night. When the house was shrouded in darkness, the chandeliers would glow faintly, casting a soft, almost ethereal light across the room. It wasn't as if someone had flicked a switch. The glow simply appeared, as though the crystals themselves were imbued with some otherworldly energy. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the entire room, but it was enough to add an eerie, yet beautiful, ambience to the space. Some speculated that it was the spirit of Dina Durbin herself, whose legendary voice had once graced the stages of opera houses around the world. They whispered that her love for music was so powerful, it had left an indelible mark on the house. Perhaps it was her spirit, forever serenading the walls, filling the house with hauntingly beautiful notes. Or perhaps it was the energy of the house itself, a place that had been touched by fame, love, and loss, that had caused these strange occurrences. No one truly knew the answer, but the House of Dina Durbin remained a captivating mystery for all who passed through its gates. Those brave enough to step inside often felt the weight of its history, and whether it was the faint glow of the chandeliers or the haunting sound of opera in the distance, they left with the unsettling feeling that the house itself was alive with something beyond the physical realm. Over time, the tales surrounding the House of Dina Durbin began to take on a life of their own. The opera music, which had once been a soft, almost dreamlike murmur, grew louder on certain nights, as if the spirit of the house itself was becoming more restless. Those who lived nearby would sometimes hear the unmistakable crescendo of a powerful aria, its beauty both enchanting and sorrowful. But when they ventured closer, the music would suddenly stop, leaving only the hum of the wind and the silence of the moonlit streets. One evening, a writer named Samuel Calder, drawn by the stories, decided to investigate the house. He had heard the rumors of the opera, of course, but he was a man of logic and reason. Ghosts, he believed, were mere figments of the imagination, and a house could not possibly emit such sounds without a physical cause. Armed with his pen and notebook, he made his way to the house at dusk, determined to uncover the truth. The house was silent when he arrived, the windows dark, but as he stepped through the gate, a strange unease crept over him. The air felt thicker here, the kind of atmosphere that made even the most rational mind pause. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, he felt a sudden chill run down his spine, as if the house itself had acknowledged his presence. Inside, everything was just as it had always been described: glistening chandeliers, antique furniture, and the faintest trace of perfume lingering in the air. But it was the silence that struck him the most. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. He sat in the living room, notebook in hand, his pen poised over the paper. Minutes stretched into hours. Then, as the clock struck midnight, it began. The first notes of the opera echoed through the room, clear and precise, as if sung by a voice not of this world. Calder's heart skipped a beat, and he looked around, half expecting to see the source of the sound. And then it happened. The chandeliers, which had been dimly glowing earlier, began to shine brighter, their crystals shimmering with an otherworldly light. Calder's eyes widened as he realized the glow was not just in the chandeliers themselves but in the very air around them. It was as though the light was coming from the walls, from the floor, from every surface that had touched the house over the years. The music swelled, a voice so powerful it seemed to vibrate through the very core of his being. But it was not just a voice. It was a presence and energy that filled the room with emotion, a longing so deep and profound it was almost unbearable. He tried to make sense of it, to explain it away as a trick of the mind or the echo of some forgotten memory. But the longer he sat, the more he realized he was not alone. The very air around him seemed to pulse, alive with something ancient. Suddenly, the opera stopped. A single note hung in the air, frozen in time. And then, a voice, a soft, almost sorrowful whisper spoke directly into his ear, though no one was there. "Find me," it said, just before the room plunged into darkness. Calder jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. The silence was deafening. He fumbled for his flashlight, but as the beam flickered to life, he realized he was no longer alone in the room. Standing in the far corner, just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. A woman, dressed in a long gown, her face obscured by shadows. She did not move, did not speak, but her presence was undeniable. And then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The house was silent once more. Shaken, Calder fled the house, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Who was the woman? Was she Dina Durbin herself? Or someone else? What had the voice meant when it said, "Find me"? As the days passed, Calder found himself haunted by the experience. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house had left something with him, a calling, a message. Desperate for answers, he began digging into the history of the house, seeking any clue that might explain what had happened that night. But what he uncovered only deepened the mystery. Dina Durbin, it seemed, had not only been a famed opera singer, but had lived a life fraught with secrets. Rumors of lost loves, of broken promises, and of a mysterious disappearance swirled around her name. No one had ever truly known what happened to her in the final years of her life. Some said she had vanished without a trace, while others whispered that she had died in the house under strange circumstances. But Calder's research also led him to a chilling discovery. In the walls of the house, hidden beneath layers of wallpaper and plaster, he found a series of symbols that matched those in an old opera score, one that had been long forgotten by history. The opera was unfinished, its last act marked by a note of discord, a haunting melody that seemed to mirror the strange occurrences in the house. The more he dug, the more he realized that the house was not simply a home, it was a conduit, a place where the past and the present intertwined. And perhaps, just perhaps, the opera wasn't a performance at all. It was a plea, a message from beyond the veil, waiting to be heard. But what would happen if he followed the voice's command and sought to find her? Would he uncover the truth of Dina Durbin's fate? Or would he uncover something far darker? The house, it seemed, had no intention of letting go of its secrets. And Samuel Calder was about to learn just how far those secrets would go to protect themselves. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Days turned into weeks, and the grip of the House of Dina Durbin tightened around Samuel Calder's mind. He couldn't escape the pull of its mystery, no matter how hard he tried. The chilling whispers, the faint opera music that haunted his nights, the figure he had glimpsed in the shadows, all of it swirled in his thoughts, like a puzzle he was destined to solve. He couldn't rest until he understood what had really happened in that house. He returned there night after night, determined to uncover the truth. Each time, he felt the house watching him, the walls holding their breath as if waiting for something to happen. The chandelier glow grew more intense with each visit, casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air, once thick with unease, now felt alive, as though it were pulsing with energy, a heartbeat of the house itself. One night, as Calder sat in the living room once more, the familiar strains of opera music began to fill the air, soft at first, like a distant memory. But this time it was different. The voice was no longer distant, it was clear, powerful, and close. The sound wrapped around him like a lover's embrace, drawing him deeper into the room. He stood, compelled by something he couldn't explain, and walked toward the grand piano, which had remained silent for years. As his hand brushed across the keys, the music shifted, as though it responded to his touch. The sound seemed to weave itself around him, pulling him into a trance. His eyes blurred, and the world around him faded, until the room was no longer just a room, it was an opera stage, with a grand audience and a single spotlight shining down on him. And then she appeared. The woman from the corner. Her features were clearer now, her face no longer shadowed but pale and hauntingly beautiful, framed by the dim glow of the chandeliers. Her gown shimmered in the soft light, the fabric flowing like liquid, but it was her eyes piercing and sorrowful that captivated him. "You found me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried with it the weight of centuries. "Now, you must understand." Her words sent a shiver through him, and before he could respond, the room began to shift. The walls seemed to melt away, revealing an entirely different space, an opera house, grand and majestic, filled with an audience that sat in rapt attention. But as his eyes swept over the crowd, his heart sank. The faces of the audience were not alive. They were faded, ghostly figures, staring at him with hollow eyes. In the center of the stage stood Dina Durbin, or rather, a version of her, one that looked as though she were both there and not there, her presence flickering in and out of existence. She sang, but no sound emerged. Her lips moved in perfect synchronization with the music, but the silence was deafening. The audience watched intently, waiting for something they knew was coming, but Calder did not. The woman beside him spoke again, her voice laced with sorrow. "This is the last act, the one that was never finished. We were meant to perform together, but the music was taken from us, stolen before it could be completed. And now, the house is the only place where the melody can continue." Calder's mind raced, trying to make sense of the vision before him. Was this the truth of Dina Durbin's disappearance? Had she been trapped here, bound to a performance that could never end? And who was this mysterious woman, who seemed to know so much about the house's dark past? The woman's gaze met his, and she stepped closer, her hand outstretched. "I was her partner," she said, her voice growing more urgent. "We were going to change the world with our voices, but fate intervened. Dina's death was no accident. She was silenced before the final note could be sung. And now, I cannot rest until the last note is heard." A deep, resonant chord struck through the silence, and the world around Calder twisted. He was no longer in the opera house. He was back in the living room, but something was different. The air was thick with tension, and the chandeliers blazed with an unnatural light. The opera music swirled around him, louder than ever, a cacophony of sound that seemed to pierce his soul. And then it happened. The final, haunting note rang out, filling the space with an intensity that shook the very foundation of the house. It wasn't just music, it was a call, a cry that reverberated through time. The walls seemed to tremble as if the house itself was trying to contain the power of the sound. Calder felt the air around him shift. His vision blurred once more, and suddenly, he was no longer alone. The audience from the opera house had appeared, faces pale and translucent, their eyes locked on him, as if he were the final piece in a puzzle they had been waiting centuries to solve. They began to chant in unison, their voices low and rhythmic, growing louder with every passing second. And then, through the crowd, a figure emerged, a shadowy form, indistinct yet familiar. It was Dina Durbin herself, or rather, a version of her that Calder couldn't quite grasp. She moved toward him, her eyes locked on his, her lips forming words that were impossible to hear. The music surged around them, a tide that threatened to overwhelm him. The woman beside him, now standing just behind him, whispered in his ear, "The music is the key. You must finish it, Samuel. You must give it voice, or the house will never be free." The final note hung in the air, suspended, waiting for Calder's decision. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the lives that had been lost, the promise that had been broken. But could he really complete the opera? Could he finish what had been left undone? And if he did, what would happen to the house and to him? As the music reached its climax, Calder felt himself being pulled into the center of it all, his body no longer his own, his mind lost in the swirling melodies. He was at the center of the last act, and the house, this living, breathing entity, had no intention of letting him go. The final note rang out, vibrating through Calder's chest, his body resonating with the power of the music. The room spun, and the house seemed to expand and contract, as if breathing with him, drawing him deeper into its history, its tragedy, its longing. The audience, those hollow figures of the past, stared at him, their eyes wide with expectation. The woman, his mysterious guide, his silent partner in this macabre dance, stood at his side, her hand now resting lightly on his shoulder, urging him to move. "Finish it," she whispered again, her voice barely audible over the overwhelming swell of sound. And then, something inside him broke. The pull of the house, the pressure of the unspoken promise, was too much to resist. Without thinking, Calder took a deep breath and reached for the piano. His fingers brushed the keys, tentatively at first, as if testing the waters of an impossible task. But the moment his touch made contact with the cold ivory, the house seemed to respond. The chandelier blazed to life, its crystals shining with an almost blinding intensity, casting ghostly shadows that danced on the walls. The music, once chaotic and fragmented, began to come together. Notes fell into place, as if they had been waiting for him to unlock them. The melody swelled, growing more powerful, more harmonious, until Calder was no longer just playing the piano. He was part of the music, his mind and soul entwined with the long-lost opera. Each chord seemed to ignite something deep within him, memories that weren't his own, emotions he couldn't explain, and the voices of long-dead singers filling the space around him. The woman beside him stepped back, her face now clear, her eyes full of both sorrow and hope. She nodded as if approving of his choice. "You understand now," she said softly, her voice blending with the crescendo of the music. And then, a sudden silence fell. The music stopped. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The chandelier light dimmed, the house stilled, and Calder's fingers hovered over the keys, his heart racing in the void that had opened up around him. He felt a presence, an energy, swirling around him, something ancient, something powerful. It was as if the house itself had become sentient, aware of what had just transpired. And then, from the darkness, a voice, soft, yet unmistakable, spoke. "Thank you." It was Dina Durbin's voice, clear and pure, yet haunting in its finality. She was no longer the figure in the shadows, no longer trapped in the space between life and death. Her soul had been freed by the completion of the opera, by the music that had been denied her all those years ago. Calder could feel the weight of her gratitude, a sense of peace that radiated through the room. The air shifted, lighter now, as if a great burden had been lifted. The house, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed to exhale, releasing its tension. The oppressive presence that had haunted it for so long was gone, replaced by a calm, quiet reverence. The chandelier light faded, returning to its soft, natural glow. The music, though no longer audible, lingered in the air like a delicate perfume. The audience, the ghosts who had witnessed this performance for so long, began to fade as well, their faces softening and dissolving into the ether. Calder stood, frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. He had just participated in something far beyond his understanding, something that defied logic, defied reason, yet had felt more real than anything he had ever experienced. The woman, the guide who had led him through this journey, looked at him one last time. "You have done what was needed," she said. "Now you are free to leave." He opened his mouth to speak, to ask questions, but before he could utter a word, the house seemed to guide him out. The door opened, and the cold night air wrapped around him like a comforting embrace. The house, its secrets finally uncovered, stood silent behind him. The music had ended, the last note sung, the final act complete. As Calder walked away, the sound of a single note, soft and distant, lingered in the back of his mind, echoing through the stillness. It wasn't the end, he realized. The opera would never truly end. It would live on, a part of the house, a part of him, a part of something far greater than he could ever fully understand. And somewhere, in the depths of the house, Dina Durbin's voice would always be singing, waiting to be heard. Calder paused at the threshold of the house, his breath catching in the cool night air. For a brief moment, he turned back, as if the pull of the house still lingered within him. The grand estate stood in the distance, its windows dark and silent now, no longer glowing with the eerie light that had once captivated him. Yet, even in its stillness, he felt the weight of something profound in his chest, a connection to the place, to the history he had uncovered, and to the music that would never fully fade from his soul. He walked away, the gravel of the path crunching beneath his feet, but as he did, something tugged at the edges of his thoughts. A whisper in the wind, a soft echo that seemed to call his name. It was faint, but unmistakable. The house was not quite done with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, some final, unspoken truth that still hovered on the edge of his understanding. Weeks passed, and Calder tried to resume his life, but he was changed. Every note of music he heard, every shadow he passed, seemed to remind him of the house, of the opera that had been completed at such a great cost. He could no longer ignore the feeling that his connection to Dina Durbin was far from over. One night, while he was sitting alone in his study, the faintest sound of opera music reached his ears so soft, so distant, that it might have been a trick of the wind or a memory half-remembered. But it was unmistakable. The same aria, the same haunting melody that had filled the walls of the house. He stood, his heart racing. The music was not in his mind. It was real. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and headed out the door, his feet carrying him toward the house once more. He arrived at the gates, breathless, the sound of the opera growing louder as he neared. The front door was ajar, as if waiting for him. He entered, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Inside, the house was unchanged, yet somehow different, warmer, as if the house itself had found peace. The chandeliers, no longer glowing with an eerie light, now shimmered with a soft, golden hue. And there, in the living room, standing in the center of the room as if it had always been meant to be, was the piano. The keys were glowing faintly, the same keys he had touched that night. The music played of its own accord, the final notes of the opera now complete. But this time it wasn't just the house that was waiting. The woman, the one who had guided him through this journey, was standing by the piano, her face soft with a sense of fulfillment. Dina Durbin was no longer a shadow. She stood beside her, no longer a ghost of the past but fully present, her eyes bright with gratitude and peace. "You did it," the woman said softly, her voice now full of warmth. "You finished it." Calder stood there, his heart full of both awe and sadness. He hadn't understood it all until now. He had thought the music was the key, but it wasn't just about the notes or the house, it was about the connection between the living and the dead, between the past and the present. The opera wasn't just a piece of music. It was a bridge that had finally been crossed. And as the final note resonated through the house, Calder felt it, a sense of peace settling in the very air around him. The house, once a place of mystery and hauntings, was now at rest. Dina Durbin's spirit, her music, her love for the art, had found its release. He took a deep breath, letting the music wash over him one last time. As he turned to leave, he knew this was not the end, but a new beginning for him, for the house, and for the legacy of Dina Durbin. The music would never truly fade. It would echo in the hearts of those who dared to listen, who sought to understand the timeless power of sound and silence, life and death, love and loss. And somewhere, on quiet nights, when the wind was just right, those who listened carefully might still hear the faint strains of an opera, carried through the air, a song that had been waiting for centuries to be heard. The House of Dina Durbin had found its peace. And so had he. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.